All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Robert K. Elder. I am the CEO and president of Outrider Foundation, and we support journalism about climate change and nuclear risk. It's my pleasure here to introduce Scott D. Sagan and be the MC for the proceedings here. Before we begin, however, just three reminders. So from 2 to 3 p.m. today, there's a fireside chat with Carl Robichaux of Longview Philanthropy and Rose Gottmuller, who's the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and the former U.S. Undersecretary for the State of Arms Control and International Security, where she was the chief negotiator for the U.S. for the New START Treaty. So that's going to be very interesting. And then at 3 p.m., 3 to 4, there are office hours for both Scott and Rose. It's a chance to ask questions and to meet with two of Stanford's fellows at CSAC who have joined us for the event, Naomi Egel and Luis Rodriguez. And then finally, tomorrow at 11, from 11 to noon, there's a speed meeting on nuclear risk. It's a good chance to meet others who are interested in this issue, and we can be engaged. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Scott D. Sagan. He is the Caroline S.G. Munro Professor of Political Science and co-director for the Center of International Security and Cooperation, that's CSAC, at Stanford University. He is the author of the award-winning book, The Limits of Safety: Organizations, Accidents, and Nuclear Weapons. His most recent articles include Revisiting Hiroshima in Iran and The Rule of Law and the Role of Strategy in U.S. Nuclear Doctrine. From 1984 to 1985, he served as Special Assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. And Scott and I met just before this, and there were so many awards, we decided to skip that section, but a lot of awards. Everyone here can read from Scott's new edited volume, The Fragile Balance of Terror, Deterrence in the New Nuclear Age. And that's available for free. You can download it at Cornell University Press, but really all you have to do is just Google The Fragile Balance of Terror. Again, Fragile Balance of Terror. And also just a reminder that at the end of this, he's going to have about a half an hour presentation, and then we're going to have a little Q&A. If you have questions, please submit them to Swapcard. Don't yell them out, but submit them to Swapcard. And without further ado, Mr. Scott D. Sagan.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Rob. I'm going to do 4 things today, talking about nuclear risk. I'll be talking about the North Korean nuclear threat, which I consider pressing but not existential. The Russian nuclear threat, which I think is both pressing and existential. And lastly, a not well understood threat, which is the threat of the United States, because I think the American public is quite dangerous in their attitudes regarding nuclear weapons. And lastly, talk about what the hell we can do about it. So I'm going to start by just giving background so you know where we are today. There are 10 states that have nuclear weapons, starting from the USA in 1945 to North Korea in 2006. One every 5-6 years. The Israelis have never acknowledged whether they have nuclear weapons or not, and the US government doesn't acknowledge it, but it's widely believed by scholars that around 1967 they acquired the bomb. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan are the only post-Soviet states that inherited the bomb and then decided, with pressure from the United States and Russia, to give them up. They never had true control of the weapons. And I believe had they tried to take control, to seize control, there might have been a war then rather than today. But they did give up the weapons and ship them back to Russia. And you have South Africa as the only state that developed nuclear weapons during the apartheid regime. And just when the apartheid regime was about to leave office, they got rid of their nuclear weapons, dismantled them, put the material into the Pelindaba nuclear power facility so that they didn't have a transition to a black rule with nuclear weapons being part of the mix. But that story, which is a slow spread of nuclear weapons, really masks a much more dangerous, alarming trend, which by my estimate, there are some 18 states that tried to get nuclear weapons, that either explored or started, from Switzerland, Brazil, Sweden, Egypt, Italy, Taiwan, not once, but twice, tried to get the bomb. West Germany, very briefly. Iran is still registered as seeking the bomb because they have not given up their enriched uranium, and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is now suspended. Syria, the last one on the, second to last one on the right, was caught with building a secret nuclear reactor. I'll show a picture of it later. And there's no one reason why these states gave up the bomb. Sometimes it was American security guarantees, like to West Germany and Italy, that we will defend you. Sometimes it was coercive pressure, like we will defend you if you don't get the bomb, but we won't if you get the bomb, to South Korea. Other times it was a effort on the part of the international community to create a non-proliferation treaty in which one state could say, I won't get the bomb if you don't get the bomb, and we'll both be better off. And the NPT is very important. And then there's sometimes there have been military operations. Iraq, not in 2003, but in 1991 to 93, after the first Gulf War, and Syria. But here's the same data put in a somewhat different manner. Because one of the themes I want to stress today is that nuclear weapons are owned by states, but they're led by states that have particular characteristics. Some are democracies, some are non-democracies, some are personalist dictators, and it matters for nuclear stability. So I know there are lots of really good data people here. What extra piece of information, what inference could you get by the same data showed now with a dot for when the country ratified the non-proliferation treaty and a color for whether they're autocratic or democratic? Who wants to raise their hand? You gonna make me call you? Anybody? Yeah.
Well, it looks like signing the non-proliferation treaty doesn't actually mean that countries don't pursue nuclear programs. Plenty of programs have signed it and then started their program.
That's absolutely right, with one important extra inference is that the blue bars are all to the left. That is, the democracies got rid of their programs and then signed the treaty and didn't restart their programs. Some, not all autocracies, some signed the treaty and either continued cheating on it or started getting nuclear materials and then cheated after they had signed the treaty. So this matters. So let me talk about, I said I was going to talk about North Korea first. So one big difference in the nuclear world today compared to the past was that new states, some of whom are nuclear states with a personalist dictator at its head, have nuclear weapons. A personalist dictator differs from your run-of-the-mill dictator in that a personalist dictator surrounds himself, and it's almost always him, with yes men. They punish people if they disagree. Therefore, they're often in an information bubble, which makes it much harder to get accurate information. They may be rational, but rationality based on very bad information can produce bad outcomes, or they may be rash, and there's no checks and balances to stop them from making a rash decision. So this is a painting of Little Rocket Man. When the North Koreans developed nuclear weapons, the United States said, we want to stop this, and the most important thing is to stop you from spreading nuclear weapons to elsewhere. And then in 2007, the Israelis came to us and said, we've discovered something that's shocking. The North Koreans are building a secret graphite reactor in the desert near the Euphrates River. The North Koreans engineers are there, and we didn't see it in Israel, and we didn't see it in the CIA in the US, because they covered it with like an old Crusaders fort. And they didn't put air defense around it. They didn't even put electric grid around it, which is why we thought it was trying to just get plutonium. They found it because the Mossad had snuck into a Vienna hotel, and when one of the engineers or scientists from Syria was going to a meeting at the IAEA, he left his computer there, and they downloaded photographs, including the ones that you're seeing here. They destroyed it. Unlike 1981, in 1981 when the Israelis attacked the Osirik reactor in Iraq, the UN Security Council, including the United States, issued a negative condemnation. In 2007, Syria and North Korea issued a defense, and the entire Security Council was silent. There's no condemnation of Israel for doing this. I'm saying, think about the dangers involved here. You all may remember the early 2018 incident in which a early warning emergency system operator announced and sent out an alert saying a ballistic missile was about to hit Hawaii. Seek shelter, this is not a drill. Some people went out, some went into the bathroom. Going into the bathroom is the right thing to do, get shelter. Some people panicked and went to look for the missile coming in. Not a good thing to do if there's a missile inbound. But nobody in Washington or at Omaha, where the Strategic Command is, or at NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, panicked. Why not? For three reasons. One, we have redundant sensors, and all those other sensors didn't say there's anything coming in. Second, we have professional operators. And these guys said, oh, we screwed up. It took a while to get the system sent out, so they actually started sending it out on social media before they could get the regular system notified, saying, don't panic, this turns out not to be real. And the third reason was that we didn't really think that North Korea was about to attack us. Use your imagination for 1 second and think what would happen if that event occurred in North Korea instead of in the United States. All three of those mitigating factors would not exist. North Koreans don't have redundant sensors. They have very few. The North Koreans would have a real problem because you don't get fired if you make a mistake in North Korea. You get killed, so you're less likely to say, sir, I made a mistake. And Kim Jong-un did think the United States was about to attack him. Why? Because Donald Trump kept saying we were going to attack him. So I think this illustrates a particular danger. And one last danger is not just of deterrence failure or false warning, but it's of a technical accident. This is Kim Jong-un observing the preparations for a launch in 2017 of a Hwasong-14 liquid-fueled missile. Use your eyes. What is Kim Jong-un doing? He's smoking a cigarette next to a liquid-fueled missile. And did anybody say, sir, dear leader, this is not a very good thing to be doing? And I think the answer is no, otherwise they took a picture of it. Again, an illustration of the problem. So let me talk about dangers in Ukraine. This is the famous photograph at the beginning of the war in which Vladimir Putin announced that Russians were going on a special state of alert. At the end of the long table with the Minister of Defense and the head of the General Staff, isolated. And I like this picture because it illustrates that point I'm making about an information bubble. Some person being remote, people not challenging him. There are other pictures that are equally alarming, but this is, I think, really symbolic. Putin, prior to the war, announced in 2018 that the Russian Orthodox Church guaranteed that if there is a nuclear war, Russians will go to heaven, others will not. And then besides the announcement of a nuclear alert, which was largely just a command and control communications exercise, there were no forces moved around as far as the United States knows. He started to make verbal threats. It's not unusual in the Cold War history to have people make verbal threats. What's unusual is the number of them, the specificity. You see them over and over again. This one, when he annexed two parts of Ukraine, raising the question of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they created a precedent. And Putin clearly knows what he's doing here. He's trying to intimidate the United States and NATO. There's a very revealing interview that he gave at the October 2022 Valdai Discussion Club. I'll let you read it there, but the point is the 8-second pause. When the questioner asks him about that we'd go to heaven if we're not in a hurry, he just looks at him, stares at him, and stares at him. And finally, he's so nervous with the silence, the reporter, it's disconcerting. He said, I did it on purpose to make you worry. He knows he's playing a little bit of the madman theory. But I think it is utterly premature for the United States to think that we have deterred Vladimir Putin. There's a literature in political science called gambling for resurrection, suggesting that leaders, especially leaders who don't have democratic checks and balances, often will take extreme actions on the verge of defeat when they think that there's no other option than to take an extreme risk. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough that it's a phenomenon in political science. And I think that people looking at Putin's actions and asking, is he deterred, are not thinking about this correctly. Yeah, he's not using nuclear weapons today, but we know from leaks to the New York Times that there have been Russian generals talking about the use of nuclear weapons. We know that Putin is making these threats, in part to intimidate us, but in part, I think, to see how it plays out. So I've been trying to think about what kinds of uses of nuclear weapons could there be in Ukraine? And I've come up with 4. The first is a demonstration strike on an unpopulated area. We thought about doing that in 1945. We rejected it because we weren't sure the bomb would work, and we thought if it did work, it might not have the political effect, and we only had one more left. At the time, we would have to wait for a second one, another week or two, and the third one was going to be even further off. I think Putin would not be interested in a demonstration strike because a demonstration strike would not demonstrate resolve. It would demonstrate weakness. So he's willing to use nuclear weapons, but not willing to kill anybody, using them at sea or an extremely remote area. So then, the next more militarily effective use would be a battlefield use of nuclear weapons on a Ukrainian military target. This, I think, is very serious. And I was really worried during the siege of Mariupol because the battalion hidden inside the industrial facility, hardened, lots of conventional bombing, couldn't get them out, were a great military target for a tactical nuclear weapon. I don't like the term tactical, for a low-yield nuclear weapon. They could collapse the entire building, kill everybody in it. I think we were lucky that that didn't happen at the time, but the Ukrainians learned from that, and at least thus far in the offensive operations, they've actually done a very good job of keeping their forces dispersed because they don't want to make a target to encourage this. The downside of such behavior, however, is that there could be battlefield uses. If you're going to break the nuclear taboo, why not do it in a larger, more militarily effective way. And unfortunately, those battlefield uses and multiple battlefield uses, if they are against military targets with not disproportionate collateral damage, would not be illegal. They'd be lawful but awful. The final one is Putin's threat to set a precedent like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and launch an attack against Kyiv or another Ukrainian city in an effort to end the war following the precedent we did in 1945. That to me was really frightening. And I don't know what the Secretary of Defense in the United States said to the Minister of Defense, or what the head of the CIA said to the head of the FSB, or what the Secretary of State said to the head of the Foreign Ministry. But I hope afterwards to reinforce President Biden's statement that if that happened, there'd be horrible consequences, catastrophic consequences. What I hope they said was, yeah, you're right. We did end the war in 1945 with the deliberate killing and destruction of 2 cities, but the Japanese couldn't strike back. The Ukrainians can, and we will ensure that they will be able to do that, and leave it open about what we would do. Now, what would we do? What should we do? I don't know. I know that in 2016, there was a war game during the last year of the second term of the Obama administration, in which they didn't have a scenario of a Russian war against Ukraine, but rather a Russian invasion of the Baltics. The Russians were losing, so they used a single nuclear weapon against a military base. And the deputies got together. And in the war game, they said, let's respond conventionally. The principals got together the next day and said, we have to use nuclear weapons. Our deterrence theory is based on doing something in a reciprocal manner. The Russians won't take it seriously unless we did. And then they were told, well, under Russian doctrine, if you use nuclear weapons against Russia, they'll know it's from the United States, they'll use nuclear weapons against the United States. So they said, well, let's use it against Belarus. So that's what they voted to do, even though Belarus was not in the fight. What would the United States do? I don't know. I know that there's a Tiger team planning for such options. I hope the deputy's action is the right one, or I hope it is the one that would be chosen, but I frankly don't know. 2 final points. One, for those of you who have read Toby Ord and William McCaskill, you'll note that they actually think that nuclear weapons are not an existential risk. Looking at some of the more recent work by Alan Robach, who said it would be a disaster, but it wouldn't create the extinction of all human life on the planet. I respectfully disagree, and I told Toby, and he said, well, let's debate this later. I respectfully disagree for 3 reasons. One, while it is true that most nuclear winter specialists think that some people would survive nuclear winter, we don't know for sure. That is, there's still some uncertainty about the modeling. And even the most robust modeling accepts that there is some risk that they may be wrong. 2, the estimates mostly by McCaskill, of how many people would die and then how long it would take for the planet to recover, don't take into account radioactivity. Our ancient ancestors building the societies that they did around the planet, from quite primitive societies to more advanced to finally where we are today, didn't have to do it in a radioactive mess. In this condition, that's exactly what they have to do. And last, and this is something I've not written about but I'm interested in, is that it seems to me that we should be worried and concerned not just about how many people die, but the way in which they die. And a nuclear war creates both prompt effects, which are horrible but very prompt, but also long-term effects. From radioactivity, from burns, from the collapse of the medical systems that we have. And I think a nuclear war would be far, far more disastrous if it was between the United States and Russia. Last threat is the United States. And here I wanted to note that many scholars think that there is a nuclear taboo, and the American public has drunk the Kool-Aid that using nuclear weapons is wrong and we would never do it. I wish that were the case. If you use polling and ask the question that we asked the American public in '45, where 53% said that we should have used nuclear weapons on 2 bombs on 2 cities, shockingly, 22% said we should have dropped more bombs on more cities and not give them a chance to surrender. Today, it looks like less than 3% give that really hawkish position. 31% say drop a bomb. Many more say we should not have used it. And 31 want a demonstration strike. And we don't know, however, from this data, if people used the demonstration strike and it didn't work, what would they do? Would they move up to the don't use it, or would they move down to drop 2 bombs? We don't know that, nor do we know, importantly, whether this is reflecting their views about nuclear weapons and non-combatant immunity, or whether this reflects their views about Japan. Just remember how hostile and racist our views were about Japan in 1945, much less so today because the Japanese are friendly, they're our ally. So Dartmouth scholar Ben Valentino and I did a survey experiment, asked a representative sample of the American public to read a story in which there's a war between the United States and Iran. The Joint Chiefs tell the president after landing US troops that we can march to Tehran and there'd be 20,000 American military deaths. Or we could drop a bomb on the 2nd largest city, killing 100,000 people. And Mr. President, we don't have an opinion on which we should do. We had 2 other scenarios, one in which we increased the numbers killed from 100,000 to 2 million, thinking, well, certainly, even if they had a situation like Hiroshima, if you increase the number of civilians killed, 20,000 US troops for 2 million Iranian civilians, numbers would go down. And then we have one in which we get rid of nuclear weapons, but say we're going to use conventional airstrikes to kill 100,000. And what we found, surprisingly, was that 55% of the public preferred and 59% of the public supported if the president ordered the use of the first option. It did not go down statistically. A slight drop, but not one that's statistically significant. And it went slightly up, but not, oh no, it's about the same in terms of whether you'd approve it. And what is statistically significant here is that using conventional weapons got a larger bump up in support. People were concerned there's a little bit of inhibition against using nuclear weapons, but not against killing civilians. Republicans were more hawkish, to include that saying the support, than Democrats, not surprising. Older people were more hawkish than younger people, not surprising. Women were as hawkish as men. And in the 2 million case, were actually more hawkish. That was surprising. And we think that's because they tend to be against the use of military force because they want to protect their loved ones, but put in a trade-off like this, they were as hawkish or more hawkish. And most disturbingly, the factor that most strongly correlates with whether you would use nuclear weapons across the scenarios is whether you answered yes to the question, do you believe in the death penalty for convicted murderers? Somehow your internal retribution qualities or vengeful qualities had a huge impact on people. A number of critics said, well, what can we do about this? And the answer is we don't know. Let's try to do some experiments to figure out. So we did another experiment where it's the same scenario, except the Joint Chiefs said we could do this, but it would be illegal. It would violate the international laws of armed conflict the US has signed. And another one where one member of the Joint Chiefs argues that. The other one says it would be legal because there's a medium-sized Iranian military base within the city, and the strike would be targeted against that base. We had another scenario in which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or somebody in the JCS said, using a nuclear weapon would break or end the 73-year-long tradition of non-use of nuclear weapons and create a new precedent that would make it more likely that U.S. adversaries would use nuclear weapons against the United States as allies in the future. And another one said, no, that's not right because the U.S., we're attacking a non-nuclear state, Iran, and nuclear deterrence would still deter any state who had nuclear weapons. And here are the findings. What we find is in the baseline, where no one's messaged or primed, it got about 47% support for using nuclear weapons. The illegal went down, but then it went back up. So the first and the third are not statistically significant. They don't differ from one another. You say, well, yeah, this is legal, and people say, okay, we'll do it. However, the precedent argument both had the most significant drop in support, and the counter-precedent went up, but it's still below the baseline. And this is in part because Democrats stayed low in all the conditions, but Republicans dropped significantly when told that this would set a precedent. So Ben and I conclude that we should spend less time trying to preach to the choir, trying to appeal to the better interests of people. Trying to appeal to the better angels of our nature. People who have better angels in nature already have them. We need to do more work to figure out what are the things that can appeal to people who don't have those views and move more hawkish people into a more dovish area. So last, so I don't leave you with all these negative comments, I want to say something positive about what you can do about it, or at least what I try to do about these problems. The first, I try to identify accidents. Toby Ord has a very good section in his book where he talks about accidents in the 1980s that could have produced a nuclear war. I think that's a very serious problem, but I think it's important not just to go, this is the difference between a political scientist and a philosopher, not just to summarize what other people have found, but to go and discover new accidents or near accidents, things that people didn't know about before. So when I was doing the research for limits of nuclear safety, I'll show two. One is in October 1962, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he had put forces on alert. The Strategic Air Command put 9 nuclear missiles on 9 of the 10 test missiles at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California. Then in the middle of the crisis, they launched a test missile. Now, the good news is that they launched the right one, just one that had radios on it, just to see how accurate it was. The bad news is that nobody on the civilian side knew that they were going to do that. And no one thought, what is the risk that the Russians observe this and think that we're starting an attack? One piece of good news here is that identifying that problem led the US government last year to postpone our planned Vandenberg Air Force test. So sometimes learning from history can reduce risks. Here's another danger that I discovered. On October 27, 1962, Major Charles Maltzby, a U-2 pilot, flew up to the North Pole on an air sampling mission. He wasn't there to take photographs. He was there to suck in air into the filters on the wings of the U-2 aircraft because the Soviet Union was continuing nuclear testing above ground, and we wanted to figure out what materials were being used. His system for navigation went out. He took an old sextant and tried to figure out where's the North Star, and he couldn't see it because the Aurora Borealis was out. So he was trying to get back as quickly as he could, and suddenly he heard Russian language on his radio. He had flown not back to Eielson Air Force Base, but he'd flown inside the Soviet Union. And he looked down and could see MiGs coming up to shoot him down. He successfully escaped, leading Khrushchev to send a note to Kennedy saying, don't you know we could have thought that was a bomber? Leading Kennedy to tell his staff, there's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. But what they didn't know was because we were at a higher state of alert in Alaska. The people who were launched to go rescue him in the Bering Straits had nuclear weapons on their planes. Their job was to shoot down Soviet Bear bombers if they were attacking the United States. They didn't have the accuracy to hit them, so they would explode nuclear weapons about them. And I've talked to these people, and they said, yeah, we're just on our own. There's no time for getting orders. We have somebody we're trying to rescue, and the F-102As were in the air with nuclear weapons. There's only one person who could have ordered the use of nuclear weapons, and that would reinforce Khrushchev's concern. Don't you think this could have been a bomber, right? Again, this whole incident was covered up and not known until the 1990s. What else can we do? Well, one, we can write and think and debate about the importance of nuclear disarmament and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You have on the right a debate pamphlet produced by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences about what the United States can do to honor its commitment to work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, and what the other non-nuclear states can do to reduce that as well. You have on the left a guide that was produced for the World Institute for Nuclear Security in Vienna, because they have a bunch of best practices books that tell people how they guard nuclear materials, and they don't have any of the incidents that have occurred in the past. So Matthew Bunn and I gathered together the history of all the dumb things that people did and produced a worst practices guide for nuclear security. Try to educate the public by writing essays, not just scholarly essays, but trying to advertise the points in popular journals, and write in conservative as well as liberal journals if you're trying to influence a broader public. You can educate the public. Stanford hosts the Drell Lecture in honor of our founder, Sidney Drell. Last year it was Congressman Ted Lieu talking about congressional efforts to restrict the ability to use nuclear weapons. Before that it was Alex Stamos from Facebook talking about the soul of the internet. And we're very fortunate to have Rose Gottemuller today, who, when she was Undersecretary of State, gave the Drell Lecture about the future of arms control. We can conduct track 2 diplomacy, or track 1.5. When the US government can't talk to people because it's too sensitive, sometimes scholars can. So here you have, Dylan might recognize this. This is Thailand. This is the bridge over the River Kwai. And I hosted a meeting there with Pakistani and Indian generals, diplomats, and scholars to say, you should learn not just from the problems that you're having, but the things that we did to advertise accidents, incidents. We discovered that the ISI, the intelligence unit, was in charge of vetting the people in the nuclear program. Not a good idea to have your spies who are running terrorist organizations be the same guys who are vetting your security. We discovered that the Pakistanis did not have a nuclear emergency search team if one of their weapons was stolen. So we had a briefing about what the United States does and what our procedures are in that area. I thought that was helpful. I was in Washington on 9/11 to have a debate at the National Security Council about what could the US government do, and the US government decided very quickly that they need to take this over after Al-Qaeda attacked us. And lastly, we need to train the next generation of nuclear national security specialists. And I'm particularly proud at the role that Stanford has played, not just creating the next generation of scholars, but also scholars who try to apply their work inside the government when they're on leave, with Tarun Chhabra at the NSC, Vipin Narang, the principal deputy for space and nuclear policy, Francesca Giovannini, who runs the program managing the Atom, and Jane Vayman, who's on leave from Temple, working on arms control at the State Department. And we have a set of fellows who visit every year, and here they are outside the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. So I'll conclude there on a slight note of hope about things that can be done. I think that my friend former General John Charlie Koshvili put it well. I asked him once, what do you tell soldiers when they went into combat? And he said, well, I would ask them, are they scared? And they would say, no, we're not scared. We're not scared, General. He said, you should be scared. Because what you're doing is dangerous. So be scared, but don't be paralyzed. Be scared just enough to do the smart things and be motivated. And I think that's a lesson for all of us. Thank you.
All right. So a lot to think about, a lot to absorb. I think because we are here at EA Global, let's start with an EA question.
Okay.
And that is, from an EA perspective, using evidence and good reasoning tools, I think, and again, Outrider is here because we believe that letting the public know and educating people about nuclear risk only helps make the world a safer place. So we believe it's one of the best things we can do to not only protect people now, but also future generations. But there's the question of tractability. Can we actually make a difference here? And again, I'm biased. But how should we go about thinking about allocating capital and talent to address this problem?
Yeah. Well, as the second polling study suggested, is that we have to be really smart about what kinds of messaging we do. I think, and I'm as guilty of as many other people, I started out saying, well, we should tell people that this is immoral to do this, to use nuclear weapons against the city. That didn't change people's view.
Yeah.
And that wasn't because no one cared about it, it's because the people who already cared about it were already against it anyway. So it was important to them, but didn't move them. And what we need to do is figure out what are the things that they haven't thought about, like precedent. Another one that has some effect is radiation. People tend not to focus on radiation, just think of these things blow up and not the horrors of killing. And we need to get that information out in front of the American public. So I'm encouraging lots of scholars to work in this area and to do not just the scholarly work that gets you tenure at universities, but then to write for journals, to write for newspapers, to do this. Use the anniversary of Hiroshima. Ellen and I published a piece called Why the Dropping of the Bomb in Hiroshima Would Be Illegal Today.
Yeah.
And that got a lot of attention because people hadn't thought about that. So good scholarship with robust evidence can have an effect, but it's a long, long process.
Yeah. And because I think it's on everybody's mind, the former Russian president came out after Putin's decision to suspend New START, said that Russia would disappear if it loses the war in Ukraine, and quote, "If the United States wants to defeat Russia, then we will have the right to defend ourselves with any weapon, including nuclear."
Yeah.
So I just want to get your reaction to that.
Well, they're upping the ante. They're saying this now about two areas that are legally owned by Ukraine that they annexed. You can't take somebody's property and then say, this is mine, and it's defensive if I defend myself. That's exactly what they're doing. And I think this is perhaps wordsmithing a bit, but the Ukrainian doctrine says that if there is an existential threat, I know you guys would like that, to Russian sovereignty, they have the right to use nuclear weapons. Giving up what they've conquered in Ukraine is not an existential threat to Russia. It's an existential threat to Vladimir Putin. It's very hard to give that message in Russia today, but I hope that we're telling the Russian generals, look, this guy's been a disaster for you. And anything we can do that creates some gap between the views of the Russian military and the senior political leadership is a good thing to do. We have to do it very carefully. I don't know if you've followed this, but I've seen at least 4, maybe more, incidents where people were pushed out of windows, mysterious accident where someone fell out the 38th floor of a window or a military officer shot himself. So I think there are signs, and you see this from Russian military commentary outside Moscow, that there are cracks showing up. Mm-hmm. And I hope those cracks continue to widen.
And just to follow up on that, so former Secretary of Defense William Perry wrote recently that part of this is a failure of U.S. diplomacy, that we started to treat them as a defeated country, that we didn't hold them close as allies, and that ultimately it's Putin who's the enemy, not the Russian people. So do you have any data about Russian public opinion, or is there a schism there?
Yes and no. No, in that the Russian people get very little independent information. And if you go out to the places where people only see official Russian TV, it's understandable that they are so supportive because they're fed how everything's going well and the Ukrainians are Nazis and the world supports us in this. It's just America and NATO. The evidence suggests that that public support has gone down. It's very hard to do this well. In Russia, if you answer a questionnaire, you gotta be really nervous that someone's gonna report on what you said. So it's very common for people to say, yeah, of course we support the government in this. There's a very clever technique called a list survey where people said, which of these items how many of these items do you support? And then how many of these items do you support? And one of the items in the second category was the special operation in Ukraine. And then you could see the difference between how many people picked for in those two things to say how many people really support the war in Ukraine. How many people, 4 versus how many picked 5, you could demonstrate that. So, and it went down significantly by about 20, 30%. Mm-hmm. That was back in the summer of 2022, and the Russians figured out what these clever pollsters were doing, and so we don't know the current numbers.
To shift focus just a little bit, I wanted to talk about the treaty on the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Can we talk a little bit from your perspective about the risks and benefits and help this audience understand that?
Yeah, so there are two treaties, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The NPT is signed by virtually all states in the world. The North Koreans are the only state that withdrew from it. The Israelis, Indians, and Pakistanis never signed it. And it requires the nuclear weapon states to work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, and requires the non-nuclear states, they can have nuclear power, but they have to agree that they will not seek nuclear weapons. And I've shown there's a lot of cheating going on, right? Frustrated with the lack of progress on the disarmament part of the NPT, a large group of non-nuclear weapon states formed together and said, let's create a new treaty. And this treaty will make it illegal not just to use nuclear weapons, but to possess them, to acquire them. And the treaty had lots of signatures, but it had one very bizarre thing. It united the nuclear states, all of whom said they would never sign this, and that they will be permanent objectors, which means legally it can't become customary international law. And then they went to their allies, and all the allies sided with the nuclear weapon states. So rather than what I was trying to do with that booklet about shared responsibility to work together towards nuclear disarmament, you have now this one wing that says the NPT is fine, the other says it's not. They had a meeting in August, just in August 2022, and they tried to reach some common language, but the US and Ukraine and a number of other states, including the vast majority of states at the meeting, insisted that there be some reference to Zaporizhia and saying that one of the new developments that we could do something about is to have no military zones near all existing nuclear power plants. And the Russians vetoed the agreement.
Yeah. And you have already anticipated my question, which is that the next step? Like, what are the need for treaties around nuclear power plants?
Yeah, I think it would be great to have two kinds of things. One would be to have a military restriction, to say that there will be no military forces put within, and you just have to negotiate based on what the range of the weapons are in that area. And the second thing that you can do is have sharing, not just of best practices, but of the techniques and the technology that makes it less likely that if a weapon does hit, that it'll create a disaster. So I'm less worried about, say, the reactor vessel than I am about the spent fuel ponds, which could burn up, or the loss of power to the nuclear vessel, which could create a meltdown, not a breaking from a missile. It would take a very large hit to actually destroy the reactor core. So I think there can be some things done through cooperation, both with an agreement and potentially some sharing of technology that can make the spent fuel ponds safer.
Yeah. So we have about 9.5 minutes left. I wanted to get to some of the questions from the audience. Thank you all for using SwapCard. This is from Tim Fist, and he says, would you expect either the US or China to use nuclear weapons if China were to invade Taiwan? If so, in what ways would each actor most likely use them?
I think it's unlikely that the US would use nuclear weapons if there's an invasion, and unlikely that the Chinese would use nuclear weapons, in part because using them against Taiwan would be using them against their brethren. There would be a possible use against an aircraft carrier, and people are worried about that. That would be the one exception. I think what the danger is here is what the Pentagon now calls a provocation that is based on somebody else being tied in. So if there's a war in NATO, the United States feels that it can plausibly defend NATO with conventional weapons. They want to have the option of escalating, but we have moderate confidence that we could defend. But to do that, we have to take a lot of stuff out of the Pacific.
Yeah.
So there's a concern that there would be aggression of that form, just as we were concerned in February that maybe Xi would use this as an excuse. And then the United States has an extra incentive to use nuclear weapons because we don't have the conventional power that could potentially shoot down. There's a very good article in a recent Foreign Affairs by Mike Brown saying, here's what the Taiwanese could do to shore up their conventional defense, and here's what the United States could do to help, and therefore we won't need to face this dilemma of potential nuclear escalation.
Next question is from Alyssa Brandt. How much impact does public perception or opinion have on U.S. nuclear policy? And how does addressing public messaging compare to other mitigation strategies?
Presidents tend to look at public polling in the following way. They find out what polls say, and then they anticipate, if I do this, how will the public react? Will they encourage this? Will they punish it? There's usually a rally around the flag effect, but it's usually short, not very long lasting. When people say, well, certainly public opinion polls about nuclear weapons wouldn't influence people, I remind people that Harry Truman commissioned a poll in 1945, not about nuclear weapons because that was secret, but about, can we have a peace treaty that spares the emperor? And the public strongly opposed that because Hirohito was a war criminal. And Truman used that verbally with people who were pushing against him, saying, I can't do this because the public would demand that I do this. After the bombs were dropped and the Japanese said, we'll surrender provided you let us keep the emperor, Truman reversed his position. But that's an example how public opinion doesn't entirely constrain, but it can shape the president's decision.
This one's from Dylan, and Dylan, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Myers? Okay, good enough. You mentioned that Ukraine's possession of nuclear weapons potentially could have prevented the current war if they still had them. Does that mean if there's a validity to Waltz's rationale deterrence theory that you'd previously given?
Yeah. So I'm a believer that deterrence has an effect. I just don't think it's perfect and think there are lots of flaws in it. So I think the likelihood that Putin would invade a state that had nuclear weapons and one that he was convinced had great conventional capability, both of which exist in NATO, that would reduce his likelihood. It wouldn't eliminate it, but it would reduce his likelihood. It comes with lots of other costs as well. And I think, to me, the most important thing over the next year will be whether the Russians use nuclear weapons or whether we successfully prevent that. The second most important thing is that if they use nuclear weapons, it's really important that they lose. Because the last thing we want for the future of nuclear proliferation is for states to say, if my big bully neighbor invades me, they're going to use nuclear weapons and they're going to win the war. If instead there's a conventional response, if Putin is overthrown, if the Ukrainians fight back, if they're resolute, that would be much better for non-proliferation. So to my way of thinking, this war is not just about the future of Ukraine. It's also about the future of democracy in the UN Charter, but it's also about the future of what kind of nuclear world we will live in the future.
Yeah. I think we have room for one or two more questions. This one is from Stephen Clare. Assuming China grows its arsenal to rival the US and Russia's nuclear arsenal, to what extent does three-way deterrence represent a fundamentally new and destabilizing challenge? And there's a second part, but I'm going to leave it there.
I'm a minority view on this. I think many people either take the position that it's very destabilizing because we need to have counterforce capabilities, and for us to have counterforce capabilities against China and Russia, we have to have twice as many, so we could deter one while going to war with the other, or deter them both independently. There are others who say, no, we just need to have a capability to destroy a small number of cities. My view is that we should sever the link between nuclear deterrence and the mass killing of civilians. Someone who starts a nuclear war, I have no problem at all having them on a target list to say that the leadership of a personalist dictatorship, who may not even care about their people, might be better deterred by a threat that they would be punished. Now, people say, well, that's sort of idealistic, and I'm not sure it is idealistic. I think if you look at Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-un, and probably also Vladimir Putin, who's sending thousands and thousands of Russian soldiers to their death every day, what they care about is their regime. And so if we base deterrence on an ability to destroy the initiator government or the leadership of the state that initiates the war that ends up with nuclear weapons, we don't have to match the Russian numbers. We don't have to match the Chinese numbers. We just have to have sufficient conventional capability to do as much of that as possible and have nuclear weapons only for the small number of targets that we can't credibly hold at risk with our conventional capabilities. But I'd like to replace the vast majority of targets that we have in our nuclear war plans with conventional weapons targeting at them that would produce far less collateral damage. When I proposed that, one general said, oh, but if you reduce collateral damage, you're going to, if you use conventional weapons, you're going to reduce collateral damage. I said, duh, that's the whole purpose of doing it. He said, but if you reduce collateral damage, you're going to weaken deterrence. I scratched my head and just thought, well, if you're using collateral damage for the sake of deterrence, it's no longer collateral. It's part of your purpose, and therefore it's both illegal and immoral.
We have a minute and a half left, and I want to ask the last question that comes in here. And again, we're all here at EA Global, and that is from Scott Lane, and that is, what role does philanthropy have in nuclear safety?
Enormous role. Every one of the items that I talked about today, whether it's the historical research about accidents, the polling information, those are expensive polls to run through to get a representative sample and ask them lengthy, complicated questions, to training the next generation to having track 1.5 meetings between Indian and Pakistanis or between Chinese and American naval officers. Philanthropy pays for most, if not all of it. And it's important that that is done because the US government would taint the operation if it was paying it. Pakistani generals are not going to come to a US government meeting about their nuclear weapons. Yeah. They might come to one if there's a scholar whom they trust, at least trust, to be fair-minded about it. Unfortunately, the MacArthur Foundation has largely gotten out of this business, but it's absolutely essential for the future of nuclear security.
Let's hear it for Scott Sagan.
Thank you.